Needham Regional Chamber, and really happy to have you with us and to have this important conversation that we're planning today. We're presented a report, featuring a report that was done by Boston Indicators and Brookings. This report came out back in October of this year. And when I saw it, I thought this was really something that we wanted to make sure that people in our market had a chance to review, especially given that there's a lot of discussion in Newton about zoning reform, and that the report itself did some case study work looking at both Needham and Wellesley, which are, as everyone knows, a key part of our region here. So I'm really grateful to Luc and Jenny for being willing to come back and do an encore presentation. Before we go, just one piece of breaking news that is probably relevant to people as they think about transit-oriented development. We've all been watching carefully what the MBTA would do in terms of service cuts, including potentially eliminating service on some commuter rail lines and weekend service. The MBTA announced this morning that it's going to wait to delay the decision about those cuts. They're originally going to vote on that this week. They're now going to look at it in February. And part of the thinking is that the federal funding that might be coming that would help the MBTA not have to make cuts as drastic. I think we're all obviously concerned and anxious to know that the transit will be here, and it's obviously so relevant to our discussion today. We were going to hear a presentation now from Luc and Jenny, who I'll introduce in just a second. A reminder to let us know who you are in the chat. Make sure you indicate all attendees and audience for that, so we can see everybody. And also, we will take some questions at the end. You can raise your hand if you want to ask the question in person, or you can put it into the Q&A button. So right now, I'd like to introduce Luc Schuster, who's the director of Boston Indicators, and Jenny Schuetz, I hope I pronounced your name right, Jenny, a fellow at the Brookings Institute, Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program. Thanks to you both for being here today. Jenny, did I pronounce your name right? Great, okay. Luc, it's all yours.
Great, thanks, Greg. Let me introduce myself, and it's just a little bit on this paper, and Jenny and I will tag team presenting the paper. So I'll present the first section of the research and then pass it to Jenny to do the core modeling sections. Jenny is with us till 1:30, so I'm going to try and do it quickly to make sure we also have time for questions while she's here. So Boston Indicators is the research center at the Boston Foundation. A long history of doing descriptive research on our region's big challenges. This year, we've started a new series of papers trying to propose big policy ideas for addressing those challenges. And so this paper is the second in that series. And the core concept we'll talk about is it's sort of based on the notion that the state ought to play a more proactive role in addressing our shared housing challenges. I see a lot of local elected officials on the call, which is fantastic. I think it will be interesting in the Q&A to get into some of the tension between where these housing policy decisions ought to be made, and so you'll see that that's a common focus of the paper. So I'm going to present the problem section of the report, and let me start by sharing my screen. All right, and let me do this by showing a photograph that I think captures well a few of our region's housing problems. There we go. So this photograph was taken in the parking lot at the Wedgmere commuter rail station in Winchester, not far from where many of you I think are. The location right here is 8 miles from North Station in Boston. The train takes 16 minutes to get to North Station at the peak of rush hour. Obviously, very good schools, well-funded public infrastructure in Winchester, and it's not a very long walk at all. I think less than a mile to a small business district from here. So what's the problem with this scene? It's just the basic fact that very few people live here. This type of housing development has led to massive housing shortages and high housing costs region-wide. Our regional economy, Chamber of Commerce audience, I think is really appropriate for this. Our regional economy yearns for more housing at a wider range of price points. but we leave far too many of our housing decisions up to local governments, even though they aren't elected to meet our region's shared needs. And it's this mismatch of interests that has led many communities in large swaths of their cities and towns to adopt single-family zoning. I'm sure everybody on this call knows what single-family zoning means. I think to the general public, when they hear that term, it feels somewhat unobjectionable, don't quite get that in practice, what single-family zoning means is it's a legal prohibition against any other type of housing. It's against the rules to build townhomes, duplexes, triple deckers, small apartment buildings. And this is really, I think, especially troubling right near valuable transit stops. The commuter rail was built out with state resources, but the state doesn't do much to expect all of these communities to contribute towards meeting our shared regional housing needs. I really think this network of train stations would be the envy of many metropolitan areas across the country, but we just aren't using this transit system to its maximum potential. Now, that picture I just showed is obviously just sort of one snapshot. The Center for Housing Data at the Massachusetts Housing Partnership has made a really neat tool that they launched earlier this year called their Transit-Oriented Development Explorer, and it allows you to see what the development patterns look like within a half-mile radius of every transit stop statewide. So let me show an example of their tool for a different train stop. This is the Wellesley Hills station area, one of the 4 station areas we do case studies of in the report. And you can see average density, sort of neighborhood wide here within this radius is 1.8 units per acre. In the gray, right around the station, you actually see some commercial development. There's shades of orange, which are smaller apartment buildings, some townhomes here, but the vast majority of this land is set aside for single-family homes. And this is what that looks like on the ground. I took these photos myself, just doing a walking tour of the station area. Beautiful, large single-family homes. And these aren't at the periphery of this half-mile radius. Each of these 4 homes is actually within a 2-block walk of the train station. Now, I want to stress something here. I show these photos not to point fingers at the individual homeowners. The point here is that these homeowners are living in the only type of housing that's allowable by law on these plots of land because of single-family zoning. So the issue is not individual, it's structural. And to me, these pictures, having so many of these types of homes in so many different parts of our region so close to transit, represents a failure of regional planning in Massachusetts. The next issue is that this contributes to car dependence and climate change. We've artificially constrained the number of homes that can live by train stations, and that obviously increases the number of solo car commutes. Large single-family homes themselves take more energy to consume, further contributing to climate impacts. The third and final problem we really focus on is related to these, which is residential segregation. And I'll just end by showing a couple of maps of Eastern Massachusetts that show the commuter rail network overlaid on top of some key socioeconomic variables. And the first is income. So this plots every city and town by the share of households living there earning over $150,000 a year. And you can see the sort of clustering of very high income suburbs to the west of Boston that are actually very close to the urban core, many of which have great transit access along the commuter rail, but are 40, 50, 60% above this high income threshold. And then a very similar pattern, although with reverse colors, when we look at the share of a community that's Black or Latinx. Some of these communities are 10% or less combined Black or Latinx share. And again, many of these communities 5, 10, 15 miles from the urban downtown core in Boston. So with that, let me pass it to Jenny, who will get into our big idea for addressing some of these challenges.
Great, thanks. And Luc, do you want to continue sharing screen?
Just wanted people to see your face for 1 second, but here it is back.
All right. So Luc set up very nicely that there's sort of these big regional problems that could have potentially a shared solution. So the premise of our paper is really to model what a statewide plan would look like that allowed moderate density housing to be built as of right along all of the commuter rail stations. And so what we did, what we're really interested in is sort of making this very concrete. If Massachusetts legalized moderate density housing around all of the transit stations, what would this look like? What kind of outcomes would this produce? And so we're going to model the likely production of townhouses and low-rise multifamily condos. We're focusing on the area within a half mile of all of the stations. And the broad framing of the proposal is that these types of housing need to be allowed as of right. Towns can't use sort of backdoor channels to prohibit them, for instance, using discretionary reviews that make this a very long and complicated process. So essentially that this is quite straightforward for developers to be able to build this. And we're going to focus particularly on how much housing you could create just by converting existing single family lots into either townhouses or low-rise multifamily. And that's because, as Luc showed you, a lot of the land around these stations really is tied up in single family homes. So imagine just taking one single family house on a big lot and converting that into side-by-side townhomes or low-rise multifamily. That's essentially the thought experiment we're playing with. So what we want to do is focus on 4 sample stations in different communities, and we pick these to vary by the existing density of housing and by housing prices in the community so far. We're going to ask 3 questions. One, is it financially feasible for developers to do this sort of conversion, to be able to create new housing without requiring a direct public subsidy? Second, what are the affordability implications? How expensive would the new housing be compared to the existing homes? And then third, how much additional housing could you create around station areas? So as a quick preview of the results, it's clear that in the 4 station areas that we look at, the developers would financially be able to redevelop single family homes to higher density without requiring subsidy. So they could do this and sell this at a market rate that would compensate the cost of construction. The higher density redevelopment would have big improvements in affordability in the most expensive places. So Wellesley and Needham of our 4 stations were the ones where you get the biggest sort of decrease in prices relative to current prices. We look a little bit at whether this would be accessible for people holding vouchers. And again, in Wellesley and Needham, it looks like this would actually meet HUD's fair market rents. Less clear what the affordability gains are in Beverly and Melrose, because housing prices are a little bit lower there. And in Melrose in particular, the density is already somewhat higher. And there's the potential to create really decent amounts of housing between about 200 and 600 homes within a half mile of station, just doing this sort of conversion of existing single family on a single parcel. And that's equivalent to about how much new housing these towns have been creating over the past 5 years. So just to show you the 4 stations that we're looking at, again, we selected places that varied in the existing housing density and in the value of housing prices so far. So the 4 stations we look at are Wellesley Hills, Beverly Farms, Needham Heights, and Melrose Cedar Park. And these do vary somewhat in how dense they are already. So to show you what some of the differences are, this is sort of modeling just a very simple graphic of the existing lot sizes in Wellesley Hills and in Needham Heights. You can see that around Wellesley Hills, the average lot size is well over a ½ acre. And so that's really quite a lot of land. A single family house lot could easily accommodate 5 side-by-side townhouses or about 11 apartments in a small multifamily building. And this would be, relatively low rise, under 4 stories. Needham Heights, the average lot size is about half the size in Wellesley. So you could fit 2 townhouses or a 6-unit condo building, right? So that's where we're going to get some of the variation in. So when we model the construction costs of these, we look at how much it would cost to buy the existing lot, to tear down the house and redevelop it using construction cost estimates for these different structure types. And so we do a comparison of what it would cost to build a new single family home, townhouses, or multifamily condos. And what you can see here is that it's always cheaper to have new townhouses or condos, essentially because you're taking the value of that piece of land and spreading it over multiple home buyers, right? So the value of just the single family lot in Wellesley is about $800,000. And so if you imagine building a new single family house, the entire land cost has to be borne by one home buyer. But if you split that across 5 buyers in townhouses or 11 buyers of condos, then each person is only paying a small share of that upfront land cost. And so you're able to bring down the overall cost of housing pretty substantially. So we should note that construction is expensive, just the materials and labor are expensive. And so you can't get down really far on the overall cost. Townhouses wind up being about $800,000 a piece. Condos would be about $500,000 a piece. And that's really a floor that's dictated more by the hard cost of construction than anything else. But that's a big decrease in cost from both the existing price of housing in those communities and the relative price of a brand new single family home. So this shows you essentially where the new townhouse and condo prices would fall relative to the distribution of prices in the communities themselves. So the existing value of housing. So you can see Wellesley on the far left here, the median home value in Wellesley at this point is about $1.1 million. So a brand new townhouse at $800,000 would be at about the 25th percentile. Right? And a brand new condo at $500,000 would be, well down to the bottom. So this is one of the cheapest kinds of housing that's available in Wellesley. Needham is the middle one here, and you can see also townhouses would actually be a little bit above the current median value, but the multifamily condos would be again in the bottom 25 percentile. So really quite affordable relative to what's already there. That carries over into the income. So thinking about who would be able to afford these homes. So the median income needed to buy a condo priced at about $500,000 is just under $100,000. And so that's clearly, that's not going to get you to affordability for low income households, but there are a lot more people who can afford to buy a $500,000 condo than people who can afford to buy a $2 million single family house. So again, you get down to more affordable households relative to the people who already live in the community, particularly in places like Wellesley and Needham. This would really make those communities more affordable to people who currently just can't afford to buy housing in those communities at all. Then to think about how much additional housing you could create, this is just a very rough schematic showing you what it would look like to have 5% or 10% of the lots within a half-mile radius converted to single family, right? So the conversions would happen essentially as markets turn over. So over time, people who live in the community sell the house, perhaps they're moving to another metro area for a job or retiring and moving elsewhere. And so as these homes come up for sale, some of them would get converted into townhouses or condos, and we're estimating between 5% of the units over a 5-year period of time would get converted, which still leaves a lot of the existing homes, right? So both for sort of advocates of this plan and people who are nervous, we're really talking about quite a gradual transition of neighborhoods. Depending on whether you're looking at townhouses or condos and whether you use the 5% or the 10% conversion rate, we get estimates of somewhere between 200 and 600 units that could be built within a half-mile of the station for each of these station areas, which may sound like a lot if you're living in the neighborhood. 600 new homes in 5 years sounds like quite a bit. That's actually equivalent to about how much many of these communities are permitting currently, except all of the new housing they're building now is single-family detached homes. Right, so this would be a decent amount of housing that you could create within walking distance of these commuter rail stations and would substantially improve the affordability. So we come to pretty clear conclusions with the quantitative analysis. This is a policy that would be financially feasible for developers. You could create housing that makes particularly the more expensive communities more affordable to people who can't currently live in the communities. You could create a non-trivial amount of housing that really maximizes the proximity to the rail station, so allows more people to live there and live in walking distance of the station. And from the state's perspective, we think this has some really strong appeal. It gets more people into ridership. It allows more people to get into new housing in some of the communities that have the best public schools, the highest amenities. So for the state's perspective, this really has a strong appeal. There are obviously some political hurdles. And so I want to finish by talking a little bit about some of the places around the country that have been doing these kinds of zoning reforms. So this has mostly gotten attention on the West Coast at this point. California for the past 3 years has been debating something quite similar to our proposal, which is to legalize higher density housing both near transit stations and in designated job-rich communities. This has been introduced 3 times, and each year it gets a little bit closer to passing. It has not gotten out of the committee at the state level and into the full legislature, but they've also been going through a process of really tweaking it. So each year the bill takes on some slightly different dimensions, and there's sort of a negotiation to get additional people to support this and also to address some of the concerns that people bring up around the proposal. Oregon is actually the first state that has done a pretty ambitious statewide rezoning. 2 years ago, they passed this statewide bill that essentially ended single-family exclusive zoning in most communities. So depending on the size of the community, it legalized either duplexes, triplexes, or fourplexes. And they had some additional kind of tweaks to, for instance, allow building on skinny lots, very narrow lots that were unbuildable before. So Oregon really worked hard to develop a coalition of affordable housing advocates, the home building industry, which obviously likes this because they can build more and make more money, environmental advocates who see some really strong climate benefits from this. And so they spent a long time kind of building this coalition to argue in favor of this and point out all of the things that this does in terms of benefits for different kinds of interest groups. Connecticut, since we're thinking about New England, Connecticut has a proposal that's on the table, also thinking about legalizing higher density housing near transit. As many of you probably know, many of the Connecticut suburbs have commuter rail stations that go into New York, and they have very, very low density housing around a lot of this, meaning that there aren't many people who can live nearby and take advantage of this easy commuting distance to New York. And then at the local level, Minneapolis was really a leader on this and passed a comprehensive plan that allowed triplexes to be built in all residential neighborhoods. So not just around the transit lines, but every residential area in the city can now allow triplexes to be built as of right. They're still in the process of adjusting their zoning to be able to implement this. And so it'll be interesting to see sort of how much demand there is. They also included higher density housing along the transit corridors and the light rail lines in Minneapolis. So we wanted to present this very much as sort of the start of a conversation. Here is a concrete proposal and a sense of what this would look like on the ground. And we fully anticipate that if there's interest in picking this up and carrying it to the state legislature, that there's going to be a conversation and a political process and some negotiation. How exactly would you want to implement this? What kind of additional terms should be included? And in particular, sort of what would you need to do to make this attractive enough to enough constituents that you can build a coalition in support of this? So I'll pause there, and we've got, I guess, time for questions now.
Great. Thanks very much to you both. If anyone wants to ask your question in person, raise your hand. Otherwise, put them into the Q&A box. Don't put them in chat because it'll just be too hard to keep. But so retype your question. We're going to start. Actually, we have a question. We're going to invite her to talk. Newton City Councilor Pam Wright is on with us. Go ahead, Pam. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you very much for hosting this. My question is, how do you get developers to build condos? Right now in Newton, we're having a lot of mixed use developments, but they're all rentals with $4,000 2-bedroom apartments. I've been told there's supposedly nothing we can do to make it into, to force the developers to do condos instead of rentals. And it's more of a cyclic thing right now. So rentals are where they make the money. What could be done though to incentivize them to do condos?
Yeah, so legally you can't require developers to build rental housing versus owner occupied. And I should say we were focusing on condos for the paper because it's easier than to do an apples to apples comparison of sale prices rather than monthly costs. But in principle, actually, this should allow the creation of rental housing. And for affordability, that's actually really important because some of these communities are places where there's almost no rental housing available. And so thinking about, for instance, how can you help lower and moderate income households who have vouchers get access to a community, creating rental housing is actually really important. It is true that for developers, condos are a more expensive proposition in a downturn because it's, people have to make a longer term commitment to buy the condo rather than renting something. And so in general, in a downturn, they're going to prefer to build rental housing. And so I think the answer is they're going to build what is financially feasible for them. And over time, you probably would get a mix, particularly in an area where there is high demand for homeownership, but for homeownership at a slightly lower price point.
Okay.
Great, thank you. And next we have over Needham, Maurice Handel, who is chair of the Needham Board of Selectmen.
Hi.
Mo, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I found the presentation very, very intriguing, and I'm very open to it. My concern, however, is that in our market, our experience has been in many locations where multifamily housing is permitted. The price point is marginally less than a single family home. So I think the developers will leverage their profit margin up on their lower overhead in construction. And the question I have is, how do you mitigate that?
Yeah, so there are two things involved with that. One is that we are assuming in our models that developers can build this as of right, and that the process is relatively short and transparent. So the advantage of that is that the soft costs of development come down quite a lot, right? So a development process where you have to go through many, many rounds of discretionary review, and it takes 7 or 8 years to get approval to build something. The cost of that very long and complicated process all get built into the price of the finished housing. If you can build by right and the process is shorter and more transparent, then that saves the developer money. And so they're able to provide housing at a lower cost to the final consumer. I do understand that for the state legislature to write a law that permits housing as of right and gets around some of the complexities is actually not that easy to implement, but that would be the goal. The other question is sort of how much competition is there locally among developers. So at the moment, because it's so complicated and expensive and difficult to build, and developers generally have to have sort of contacts within the community and understand how the process works, that the developers kind of have a local monopoly, and then they can charge a higher price. By making this a simple process as of right, it enables more developers to build this product. And so you can have, for instance, small local developers who are working on relatively small margins could do these small projects, right? And again, sort of, building a 6-unit or a 10-unit building is something that a small developer can do. And in fact, it's not generally that attractive to sort of the big developers who want to do a 200-unit project. And so because you can have then sort of a competitive ecosystem of smaller developers who are all bringing these projects online, no one developer has the monopoly and the pricing power. So they have to set the final prices closer to the cost of construction.
Can I respond?
Please.
I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think it's a little bit analogous to medical care. The price is not a function of cost. It's a function of demand. And the demand is high enough in these communities that the profit margin is going to go up. We have many projects that are essentially by right. And those in neighborhoods where single family houses are coming down and multifamily or 2-family or 3-unit, 4-unit buildings are going up, not just 40B. I think you're underestimating the effective demand on the price. It's not the cost of construction.
Yeah, so we do know there's a lot of economic research on differences across regions and housing prices. And we know that in regions where the barriers to development are lower, where housing is easier to build, more dense housing can be built as of right, that regions' housing prices are much closer to the cost of construction. And I would say that one of the important things about having a statewide program is it's not just how much housing gets built in Needham. It's how much housing gets built around all of the commuter rail stations in the entire greater Boston area. So this statewide policy would mean that developers aren't just going to the places they're allowed to build, they're now allowed to build many more places, right? So you get this much broader kind of diffusion of where new supply comes online. right? And that larger supply effect and sort of bringing down the barriers, both are going to be really important so that developers are able to build at a lower cost to themselves, and so that there's more competition among developers and less pricing power, right? And we do know that in the aggregate, other regions do not have housing as expensive as Boston. Other regions build more housing than Boston, and the prices are lower. It's getting to that point, right? And it would take some time for prices to sort of adjust downwards, but sort of refusing to take policy steps in the right direction is not going to help you towards getting to that new equilibrium. And I apologize, I'm actually going to have to jump off. So Luc gets to take all of the rest of your tough questions.
Jenny, thank you very much for your time. Much appreciated.
Thanks very much.
Yeah. And a reminder to everyone that we will send a link, well, there's a link already in the chat to the presentation itself, to the full report, as well as a video of this and a copy of the presentation. If you want to ask a question in person, raise your hand. Otherwise, I will run through some of these. Luc, I don't know if you looked at questions in there. Luc, you want to pick one that you've already taken a look at, or want me to ask you?
Yeah. Yeah, is it okay if I scan around? It won't be comprehensive at all because there's both questions in the chat and in the Q&A, all good stuff. One thing just to flag, just to underscore from the chat, is Larry Field notes that there's a provision on the Senate side of a conference committee, a bill, an economic development bill in conference committee right now that would directionally do something very similar, requiring every community with an MBTA station to plan for a multifamily housing zone within a half mile of the station area. So one thing I actually be curious, it's hard to have a back and forth in the Zoom setting, unfortunately, but over the last several months of working on this report and talking to local advocates, and then in the last month and a half since we've released it, I have gotten the sense that there may be a bit of momentum in Massachusetts around doing zoning reform, considering zoning reform that's less town by town and more, unfortunately we don't have much regional government to do this, so it probably would have to be state if we're going to act more collectively. But I don't know, I'm curious if that jives with other people's sense that there is more of a conversation around doing this. It's been a couple years since some other states have been first movers, so if there's an opportunity, I'd be curious for people's on the ground read of the political viability of doing more of this through state action.
Okay, and Luc, I'm going to invite in Deb Crosley, who is another Newton City Councilor and also chair of the zoning committee, and see if she has either a question or wants to comment on what you just brought up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to jump off quickly, so I was just trying to write it out, but thanks for recognizing me. So although I'm fascinated with this because I think a more equitable set of rules across the Commonwealth that helps to facilitate housing supply will eventually make a difference. Although we cannot control costs or price points, we can control size and the uses that are allowed. And Newton's a little different from the slightly further out communities. We have many transit stops, particularly along the Green Line. Concerns about the ones along the commuter rail, but let's just take the Green Line. We have communities that have relatively smaller lots with great big houses on them. Some of the things we're considering, we're in the early stages of considering, are allowing two-family by right proximate to these transit stops, and allowing some of these very large homes to become multiple units. And I'm sorry, let's see, Jenny had to leave already because she may have this information, but I'm wondering if you have or could look at the redevelopment opportunity. One of the things our community cares a lot about is not losing a lot of these beautiful old homes. And a lot of them are in very good condition. It generally costs more, we believe, to rehabilitate an older home, and not to mention the vertical circulation you need to convert it to additional units. But we have some excellent examples with, like you said, a 2-minute walk to public transit. And I wonder if that's something that you have looked at or could look at.
Yeah, we did look at it. It's not in our model, but Jenny mentioned, I mean, the way we designed this was to have a good deal of simplicity for making sort of the initial case. As this went through the legislative sausage making, this is the kind of thing that would have to be considered. One example is Jenny mentioned the SB 50, the bill that in the last session in California almost passed, doing something quite similar. My understanding is it went through 3 successive legislative sessions to get to where it was last year. And each session was more of that sausage making and considering additional provisions. And one thing they added last year was to address exactly this concern. So there was some definition of housing stock built pre-1950 that was a sort of loose sense that those were more historic homes that ought to be preserved. And there, rather than allowing for tear downs, it allowed only for a rehab project that would subdivide it from a single family to a 2-unit. So, if you add provisions like that, you reduce the potential number of new units you'd add, but you still get some modest new density potential, and you help preserve some of that character. So I think that's worth considering if there's ever interest along those lines here. And the question is how you design it in a way that's uniform across communities and allows action without too much time.
Well, I'm glad to hear you looked at that. Do you have any material on it? And it also kind of dovetails more nicely with our climate action plan as well, in terms of, there's a lot of embodied carbon in these buildings, and taking them down can be seen as wasteful as well.
Yep. Yeah, I'll try and dig up where I saw that write up on the SB 50 and share it with Greg. The other thing I'll say, which I think relates to something you said earlier, Deb, is just really important to keep in mind that, again, because we were trying to design a relatively simple sort of first proposal, the density levels are all the same for so we proposed as of right up to 20 units per acre. You could make a strong case that you'd want that to be more variable as you get towards the urban core. I grew up a block from the Porter Square Red Line stop in Cambridge, and I remember looking at the MHP density estimates for Porter Square, and I think Porter Square is close to 20 units per acre right now. Nonetheless, Porter Square could use a lot more density too. I mean, you've got Red Line right there. You've got the bus running up Mass Ave straight into Boston. In most of the buildings along Mass Ave, very close to the urban core, are 2 or 3 stories. So you could get a lot more in Porter Square. So I could imagine a proposal like this that actually, allows up to 30 units per acre. If you're within 3 miles of downtown Boston or something, you kind of taper it out as you go further. So that's just another kind of thing that I think should be in a discussion like this.
Luc, a related question in terms of environmental impact. Someone asked if your report or anyone else's report quantifies the environmental impact, so you can really measure the canopy, carbon, open space.
It's just so tough. So no, that was not a part of the scope here in terms of the actual modeling.
Okay. Again, if anybody wants to raise their hand, and we're going to actually let's recognize. Oops, somebody lowered their hand. We have one more elected official, and then we'll try to get to some other folks. Selectman Dan Matthews is on with us. Selectman Matthews.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
We can.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, Luc, and thanks to Jenny too. This is the same point that I raised in the Q&A, but it's important to us here, which is, and we hope that it'll be clarified if there are future editions of the print materials. The study makes important points, but to be clear, there's some language in the report suggesting that Needham has allowed only single-family development in recent years. That isn't so. We had 705 multifamily units during the 2015-29 study period. That doesn't close out the general case, but you're here, we're a member of the chamber, and we need the people that are on this panel and in our communities to understand that we take housing policy issues seriously, and we have tried to work within our community to build a consensus and take some positive steps forward. I think we've made some progress. I think going to the exchange that Mo and Jenny had earlier, it is a regional problem that needs a regional, to be addressed regionally if we're going to be successful at it in this market. The big issue being that in the metropolitan area, there are literally 101 separate planning authorities. And I think building some consensus, probably working through the legislature, but maybe through the mayors associations or other things, there are things that we can do, but it's no one. I think the point that Mo raises about individual towns trying to go it alone, it gets difficult. But our key thing is we think that this raises some good points. It's worth looking at. But as we said, we have done a lot in this, and the report is a little unclear in the way that it presents that. Thank you.
So thanks, Dan. So let me just, I'm eager to check the report. First of all, I totally believe you that Needham has produced multifamily housing in the last 5 years. So if we wrote the report in a way that suggested that was not true for Needham, I genuinely apologize, and I'll just check that after. My recollection was that a couple of the four had produced hardly or permitted hardly any new multifamily housing. But anyhow, I will just check that. And we will make a correction if there's a mistake there.
Thank you, Select Matthews. Luke, you were looking through the questions. You want to take something on, or should I field something to you? Your choice.
I'm scanning it as I'm thinking. If there's anything jumps out at you.
Well, we have Diane P. on the wants to speak, so we'll let Diane P. in. Diane.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to know what these units would look like in terms of like size and the quality of the building. Right now, I'm in Newton. A lot of the new development starts at like 500 or 600 square feet for a studio, and a 2-bedroom would be maybe up to 1,200 square feet. So I assume something more affordable would be smaller, and just what would these condos look like in terms, compare them to what we're seeing now?
So the way we've designed this wouldn't prescribe any of those particulars, really. I think it actually gets back to the back and forth that Maurice and Jenny were having, which is just, if something like this happens only in one community or one station area, you're going to have very different effects than if you do it region-wide. So the hope is that you do something at scale region-wide, and the market would shift hopefully somewhat dramatically so that it becomes more profit, so that developers would sort of move down the market to not only doing luxury housing, but provide more middle-class housing, and you'd get just a broader range. Right now, it's just so constrained the way we approach things that you only get a narrow slice of the type of housing. One other sort of tangential response that I'm remembering kind of relates to one or two of the questions I noted too. Jenny made a really interesting point in an interview I heard with her, gosh, a year ago now, that has stuck with me since, which is we shouldn't think about the housing crisis that high income metro areas like Boston has as one single crisis, but rather as two crises. And the way she distinguishes them is, one is kind of a middle income market rate housing crisis where we have so constrained the ability of the market to respond dynamically to demand that middle income families who really ought to be able to pay out of pocket for decent, safe, affordable housing on their own really struggle. So housing crisis one is the sort of market housing crisis. And then housing crisis two is much more specific to very low income families who, even if we made a huge dent in reducing market housing costs, would nonetheless still struggle to pay those costs. And for those families, we need to be honest with ourselves that it's going to take direct public subsidy to help buy down the rent so that lower income families can find safe housing. And there are lots of programs, through tax credits, through direct vouchers, through the construction of public housing, and we do it in a variety of different channels. But I find that construct really helpful, and sort of bringing it full circle to this report. Think of this report as really mostly focused on crisis one. This is about over time trying to make a real dent in market rate housing costs, building condos, multifamily housing in some of our higher income suburbs so that more middle class families can afford to live there. And we need to be sort of clear-eyed about the fact that that is not going to do enough to provide for the needs of the lowest income families among us, who there it still is going to be more of a subsidy question, and we need to act on that front at the same time.
Yeah, I think a lot of the questions here, Luc, are folks wanting your crystal ball and how we actually pass these things or get communities to embrace them. I realize that wasn't what you were trying to do there, but there's a question here about have we considered reducing or eliminating parking minimums? Is that part of the calculations, less parking in these transit-oriented park spaces projects?
That is the type of regulatory barrier that makes it hard to do these sorts of projects. Yeah, so that's the kind of thing that would need to be considered in passing legislation like this to scale those back to make these projects feasible. On the crystal ball question, Greg, if I may,
yeah, please.
Two related thoughts. One is, I have found the Oregon and Minneapolis stories really fascinating about how they built broad-based coalitions to do this. Jenny mentioned those a little bit, but I think we have a lot to learn here in Massachusetts. Particularly in Oregon, the advocates there talked about how they got developers and tenants' rights organizations at the same coalition table to push for that change. And I think you need a broad group of folks like that all rowing in the same direction to pass big reform like this. And I haven't seen that type of work, successfully taking root yet here. There's lots of folks talking to each other, and actually the provision in the Senate side of the Economic Development Conference Committee bill is actually a good example. But to get something like that across the finish line, I think we're going to need a broader coalition like that. The other thing I'll say, and this is more of just a personal take, but I do worry that in Massachusetts, there's a desire for state legislation to be this sort of comprehensive slam dunk, fix all of our housing problems at once. And if the piece of the housing crisis that I'm most concerned about isn't in the bill that's being debated, I'm not going to support it. And I just really worry that that's not effective. I think there are so many varied dimensions to our housing challenges. Like with the housing choice bill, I thought it was a real mistake that we didn't, even if that's not going to do everything we need to be able to have majority rule in cities and towns in Massachusetts making decisions around local zoning, and let's just pass the dang thing and then move on to other housing priorities. And I'm somewhat skeptical it's going to be one master comprehensive package that's going to fix everything all at once. So
yeah, I agree with you that the housing choice would make a huge difference in of itself, won't solve everything that we want to do. A question is actually we've gone there a little bit, but it's from Susan Albright, who's the city council president in Newton. Developers want to make 2.5 times the purchase price. In Newton, this means that two-family houses are still well over $1 million, with an average purchase price is $1.2 million. In order to make 2.5 times the purchase price and still make the condos attainable, say 500,000 K each, there would still have to be 6 condos in a single-family lot. Do you think this would be politically successful? I think you covered it a little bit, but I don't know if you want to add anything there.
yeah, the only thing I'll add is just, again, I mean, developers, why not want 3 times? I mean, at a certain point, it does come down to what we allow through the market. And that is just so extremely constrained right now that the scenarios that are currently being sort of debated and contemplated are so oddly artificial to begin with. It's hard to know what the world will look like if we allow for different types of housing near transit at scale.
Yep. A comment from anonymous attendee. Yes, crisis is not really an appropriate term in most cases. COVID is a crisis, other than low income housing is a problem. I'm not sure I agree with that, but I think it's a crisis. But we have time maybe for one more question if anyone wants to raise their hand and ask it in person. I think we've been through most of what's written here. in one way or another. If not, well, thank you, Luc.
Can I just, sorry, Greg, do you mind if I jump? I see just from Lynn Weisberg at the end, at the bottom of the questions, just thrown in there about,
Okay.
have we presented to state legislators or housing and development agencies? We've done several presentations of this, not sort of directly briefing legislators yet, actually would be eager to do that. Another, just harkening back to Oregon, the way that I've heard that story told there is once they passed, so the first thing they passed a year and a half ago was very modest statewide upzoning, just allowing up to duplexes statewide, which is, you know, still really at scale a big difference. But that in their experience, that really opened up a new set of conversations that sort of unlocked some gridlock they were having on housing before. And so the city of Portland, after the state of Oregon did this, did a much more ambitious upzoning just within the city on the heels of what the state did. So it's all to say, I think there's some unsticking would love to try and contribute to of our housing debates, where so many great advocates are doing great important work at the municipal level. How do we sort of get some of that to help unstick us at the state level, I think is a place I'd love to see this go.
That's a great point. And, you know, I actually, as long as we have a minute, it'd just be great to let people know what else Boston Indicators is working on and what's coming up. You guys have done such important work.
Yeah, that's sweet of you to offer. Maybe one thing I'll just plug is, speaking of COVID, we launched with the Center for Housing Data at the Massachusetts Housing Partnership, something that's called the COVID Community Data Lab. And it was our kind of best effort attempt to bring together whatever real-time data sources we could find on how the region has been affected by the pandemic, and really much less on public health terms and more on housing trends, transportation trends, the economy. So if you go to our website, bostonindicators.org, you'll see a link right there to the COVID Community Data Lab. And it's just a good way to keep track of, in sort of real time, how other measures of regional and statewide health are, again, not public health, but things like transportation usage are tracking as we now are sort of in the midst of a second wave of the virus, and there's concerns about another wave of layoffs and that sort of thing.
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you for joining us today. This is the second time we've done a program with you, and we're grateful that you've put aside some time to join us today.
Really appreciate you inviting me, Greg, and great engagement, tough questions. I really appreciate the Q&A. So thanks, everyone.
Great. And thanks, everyone, for participating. And reminder, we will send you all the materials that we talked about today in an email a little later on. Have a great day, everybody. Be safe out there. Take care.